I think I'd say welcome back again to most of you, and particularly to those who've stayed the course and come for all three sessions at the Theatre Museum. It really is sort of very interesting, I think, to be able to be here and to document some of the things that have happened in Rombert's history. As I think most of you know by now, it is our 70th anniversary. And so we began by looking at a ballet club, then yesterday moved to what I've described as the middle years of the company. Middle at the moment, hopefully not middle forevermore. Keep going a nice long time yet. And today the idea is to bring things up to date. Now, don't look at the empty chair and think, oh dear, no Christopher Bruce. Christopher Bruce will be here, and we're going to all pretend we're on television and move along a seat, so that the new speaker comes and takes the hot seat, so to speak. So, so that's really how we're working things today. Obviously, in terms of Christopher Bruce, he's having a very busy time, not only in terms of the season at the Coliseum, but the company generally. However, I thought what we'd do to sort of start with was to look back a little bit, so really going back over the last decade or so, and talk to two dancers who've been with the company for a long time. And as is the case with Rombert, it was Peter Ustinov who described every dancer who'd been to Rombert as wearing the old school tights. Peter Ustinov being the, I mean, I know he's a famous actor, but as far as we're concerned, the son of Nadia Benoit, designer of Dark Elegies, amongst other things. That's right, yes, yes, so very much part of but that was the origin of that phrase. Once you've been involved with Rombert, you very rarely get away. In terms of our two speakers tonight, Mark began as a dancer and has continued to be involved with the company as a choreographer, and so in that sense, interestingly, he left the company and his work gone was mounted on the company quite significantly, because he was there, so to speak, as choreographer, and he has continued his most recent piece, Banter Banter, choreographed for the company in 1994. Amanda, having danced with the company for the best part of a decade, still gets called on every now and again to help us with education projects. Indeed, she'll be doing a session with myself tomorrow in Kent. So in that sense, having moved on to a freelance career as a performer with a number of different companies, but probably most notably with Siobhan Davis, again, somebody who's not allowed to escape the fold. Mark, I should of course say, has his own company now, but fortunately also does quite a lot of freelance work, not only with us, but also with Scottish Ballet, so somebody who's actually involved in a number of different directions. Now, I'm going to ask the question that I've asked everybody else, so sort of sat there, and this time I think we'll get rather different answers. I've actually begun by asking everybody about meeting Marie Rombert. So it's not a case really of when did you first meet Marie Rombert, but did you actually have the privilege of meeting Marie Rombert? So we start with Mark, since you arrived first.
Yes, I did. I was in the company in 1979, 1980 for a short while to do Ferdinand and the Tempest, and there Ferdinand had run away to join Lindsay Kemp, and I was brought in to do the rest of the season because I'd met Glenn Tetley at a choreographic workshop, and Mim, as they call her, arrived to have a photograph taken because it was her birthday. And she wasn't the sort of person who walked across the room, it was a polonaise. And she announced to everybody that it was marvellous that we were all there because it was her birthday and she was going to be on the front page of the newspapers. And she watched a couple of rehearsals.
So that was your experience. How about you, Amanda?
I didn't get to meet her, which is something I always felt very sad about, actually. Yeah, it's sort of a question of tales that when I first joined the company, there were a number of dancers who'd been there for a long while. Kathy Beck, for instance, and Diane Walker, and people like that, been there for a long time, and they would sort of tell tales of how she used to sort of get carried up the stairs and
That's right,
come in and
yes.
watch rehearsals and things like that. One always felt there was a shadow of a presence, but that was it, I'm afraid.
Yes.
Sad.
She,
I'd love to have met her.
she often was a dancer, Lucy Burge, who I was partnering at the time, and she used to call her every day and ask what was going on in rehearsal. So,
Really?
I was there a few times on the phone and went, oh, hello, Mim. And whenever she was coming into the studio, Lucy Burge would disappear and come back with lots of makeup on.
I think it is important to be aware there was that real interest in the company right up to the point at which she died in 1982. Nevertheless, Amanda, you are very much a product of Rambert, not only having been to the Rambert School before that, your earliest training,
Absolutely.
Rambert orientated.
Absolutely. My teacher from age 12 to 16 was Shelley Reese Edwards, who'd been in the Rambert company. So it sort of felt like very much. And then I went to Rambert School, and under the direction of Gary Sherwood, who'd also worked with Rambert, and I got into the company. So yeah, it's very much felt like I was part of that thing. Proud to be.
That links up very much with before. Although I don't suppose your audition was for the school was actually taken by the secretary. We had stories of that
so.
yesterday.
Oh, really?
How to join Rambert if you're a man.
Yes.
Okay, I think the thing to do is actually sort of talk about some of the choreographers that you had the opportunity to work with. We've already mentioned Glenn Tetley, so perhaps if we just continue about sort of your experiences of working with Tetley as a choreographer.
I think Mark should start because he worked with Glenn more than I did.
Well, I did Pierrot Lunaire, which was a big privilege, and it was already famous because, in fact, Christopher, I think, as a dancer, had really made it himself very famous by doing this particular role. So it was really quite nerve-wracking to have to try and do it. And we did it for about 4 years, and it was incredibly exhausting. I mean, it's like running around the block backwards 6, 12. You know, it's one of those pieces where you gag, and every time you go to rehearse it, you think, oh my gosh, not again, because it's very painful. And he had sort of captured a style that Rambert had in the 70s and 80s, am I right? Very early 80s, 60s and 70s. That sort of came along when it was revived, when Robert North and Richard Olsen were choreographers. And the style mixed classical ballet with Graham technique, and he was the first dancer to have learnt both of those techniques, and he was the first dancer he was asked to be a principal dancer with the American Ballet Theatre at exactly the same time as he was asked to be a principal dancer with the Martha Graham Company. And so he was considered revolutionary at the time because before then the two worlds had been pretty separate, and he came up with a choreographic language that moved easily between both of them.
So your first exposure to Tetley was actually on your course. Was it the?
It was on the Gulbenkian course.
Gulbenkian
Yeah.
course,
So
yes.
I had a way into his work because every day he would set a new task and talk about how he had managed to answer this task. Richard Carre was one of the tasks, which was a piece that was in the Rambert repertoire for a long time in the Rite of Spring, and what the dancers used to call gushius mushius. Instead of moving in steps, it was very connected, and he'd always go on about sequential movement, and it happened from the core of the body and the crutch, Amanda.
That's right. Absolutely.
And he treasured dancers with a lot of facility, I think, because his stuff was very difficult to do. You needed to be incredibly loose and
Very Graham-based.
Yeah, extremely Graham-based.
Graham-based.
Yeah.
Centre.
Were you there when he did Richard Carre?
Yeah.
Because that was very difficult. He was talking about the original cast, who was Mary Hinkson, and he said she had the body of a modern dancer. I shouldn't send him. I mean that as a homage, actually, and the legs of a ballerina, and
that was his ideal of perfection, I think.
Yes, and I think Christopher, as a dancer, most people only had those two things as a male dancer: incredible legs and feet, and a body which had a lot of power and contraction.
So in fact, when you both arrived, sort of Graham technique was really sort of part of the basis of the Rambert orientation.
I mean, we
wasn't
both
it?
trained, didn't we? In
Yeah,
Graham?
oh,
Yes,
absolutely.
yeah.
That was my first experience of modern dance, was Graham technique at school.
Me too.
Solid 2 years, Clover Roop.
In fact,
Cracking
Clover
the
Roop
whip.
taught the company,
Yes.
and there was a woman from Germany that used to come and teach us. Do you remember her name?
No, I don't.
Yes. Clover Roop was referred to yesterday as one of the dancers who had been one of the first to go from Britain to America to work with Martha Graham, and then came back and was involved right from '66 onwards, and then also worked extensively at the school. And there is that sort of sense of continuity that comes through sort of over and over again with dancers and teachers. So, having come into a company that was sort of Graham orientated in its approach to contemporary dance, how did you find it as the company evolved through the 1980s?
Well, I was an introduction to Cunningham technique, which, I mean, primarily, I think, is a whole different ethic, really. I knew nothing about it at all. Frankly, I'd had no experience of Cunningham technique at school. I think they do now, but at that time, you know, I didn't know what it was at all. So it was all green cheese,
Most
really.
Cunningham was actually a dancer in the Graham Company,
Yeah.
and he studied a lot of classical technique with Margaret Krask and Maggie Black, and a lot of her works from first position. So he mixed the two. He had his Graham trained body on top of classical legs, and they no longer sat on the floor. So actually, having done a lot of Graham, it wasn't that alien actually.
There's a kind of mixture of that and ballet. It's much
Yeah.
closer to a classical technique, actually.
Yes.
I think it's of the modern techniques the closest to a classical technique.
And actually, I was actually in the company for that short while when Richard Alston first came to the company, taught his first class. You were about 10, I suppose. And
not quite.
and it was interesting because it was the first time, you know, the company had been exposed to someone who come back from America with this new way of looking at the technique to make dancers.
It's a sort of parallel situation again. We heard yesterday about Norman Morris and bringing back the Graham sort of ideas, and here's Richard Alston coming in. And shortly after he had come back from America, having done some freelance work, being invited to first teach and then choreograph, and then ultimately become a choreographic associate of the company. And so bringing in new ideas and expanding the horizons. But when you first came, it was really the period that one sort of thinks of as the triumvirate of choreographers.
Very much so, piece by each.
Robert North, Christopher Bruce and Richard Alston. And so, whereas yesterday John Chesworth was talking about the sort of 2 ballets a year, it'd be one classic and one of Norman's in the very early 60s. We got to the point where there was one of each choreographer, and you might get an extra one from outside as well. It was that sort of approach, wasn't
Absolutely.
it?
Yeah, very much so.
It was good actually because there was always 3 pieces in the evening, and one would be by Richard, one would be by Robert North, and one would be by Christopher. So it was actually a very good mix.
Absolutely.
And then for
The
someone like
program
me,
was always quite balanced because of that. Yeah.
and it was good for the audiences. I expect this is all very subjective.
Of that period, are there works that you sort of still remember particularly fondly in terms of performing?
And I remember Richard's first work was called Bell High,
Oh, yes.
which there's no
I
record
saw
of.
it.
And Pierre Lunaire, which I always thought fed a lot of the way Christopher moved. But he did things like Night with Waning Moon.
Yes, which we revived later on. Yes.
And
Absolutely. Wildlife, Richard's piece, Wildlife.
Intimate Pages.
Intimate Pages, yes. Sergeant Ellie's Dream.
Sergeant Ellie's
Which
Dream.
later came back again.
I think perhaps Wildlife is a work that's worth talking about because it's very much part of one of the sort of key trends of the 80s, which was sort of real collaboration, bringing in fine artists, having music specially commissioned. So, Mark, you were very much involved in that, weren't you?
Well, it seemed to me that it was still the Rambert thing. It was something that came from the Ballet Russe. That they didn't do full evening works. The Ballet Russe did triple bills, and they worked with composers and artists of the time. And it was that idea still going on, which I think was very nice to be involved with. And it was a British composer and a British artist living in New York, Dick Smith,
Yes,
Richard Smith,
yes.
who trained in London at the Royal College of Art, and made these kites that turned around as the piece went on. And actually, I have to say, it was very much informed by what I think of as something American, almost like New York City Ballet. In fact, it had quotes in it, which I was looking at this morning, actually, from Argonne, from the Pas de Deux. Did you do that Pas de Deux?
No, I did the blue part.
Oh yes.
Run on the pitch black.
Well, there was a part where I lay down on the floor and my partner
That's
Ponche,
lovely.
and I held her hand and shifted my feet to the left. And so I was very aware that there were these quotes from an American base, because actually I suppose Glenn Tetley was more European than American, and Christopher Bruce's work was much more from perhaps the school of Kurt Joss, and it was European in a way.
Yeah, I think that's important because there was definitely an American shift, wasn't there? American flavour to a lot of the work we did subsequently.
And London Contemporary at that time, I have to mention them, didn't seem to be producing a lot of works based on Graham technique. So there was room to shift the choreographic base. But Ghost Dancers was a very big, important piece, I think, around this time. And I had worked in Australia before I joined Rombe and had done Ghost Dancers there, as well as several other of Christopher's pieces, Black Angels, for instance. And I said, oh, I think I'll just go to where they do the real thing, you know.
So really it was the Christopher's work that drew you to Rombe.
Well,
actually.
I had seen Richard's work as well, so it was basically both of them. To begin with, it was absolutely both of them. I really enjoyed doing Ghost Dancers, and I'd been exposed to Bell High, and I got it into my brain at that time that Richard was some kind of new voice, and Christopher made these fantastic sort of emotionally based, close to the music pieces, because it was the beginning of when he used a lot of folk music, and that was kind of interesting and sent ripples through the world, I have to say, in that respect.
So, I mean, you were actually involved in the creation of Sergeant Early's Dream, weren't you?
Yeah.
Doing sections in there, and that's obviously a very typical example of
That
the whole
sort of
folk
came
element.
later, but you know, I think
Indeed, Ghost Dancers as well. I mean, that was very much a sort of South American folk music, completely responsible for all the use of panpipes in movies now. I mean, really, hear it all the time.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yes, yeah, and it was true that there were crowds at the stage door for the musicians and not the dancers. So, and in fact, music has, I think, always been an important part of the companies.
It always occurred to me at that time that Christopher was using this folk dance music, and Richard suddenly seemed to be interested in African rhythms, like Mbira was one of them, and Nigel Osborne came up with lots of things that were inspired by
African instruments as well, like the zansa.
And what was the great big piece we did? We took to New York.
Yeah, the zansa.
Zansa.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think Amanda was there's kind of like a generation of dancers that summed up a sort of certain physicality that Richard had brought.
Yes.
Long, loose, rhythmic.
So
All improved now.
then, in terms of the company's development, there was obviously a marked change when Richard took over as artistic director. It was no longer the sort of the idea of having 3 in-house choreographers. There was much more a single style in some ways, but it was no longer. It wasn't limited to one.
Much more an open book. Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And bringing in more of the Cunningham pieces.
And actually a lot more American choreographers.
In general,
Yeah, Trisha Brown, Lucinda Childs.
David Gordon.
So a whole list, which was great for us because, you know, we live in Europe, and so to have that other influence come in, and especially for someone like me, who's a choreographer now, to be exposed to all of that stuff was just, now when I look back on it, it was a complete thrill, actually, because it's, you know, lots of bits of wood in the fire of different nature.
I wonder, Amanda, if you'd like to talk a bit about working with Trisha Brown.
Oh, It was just, yes, I would. The most wonderful experience, quite eye-opening. Completely changed my views on dance, absolutely, totally. You know, with sort of one fell swoop. It's just knock everything out that you've ever thought about dance and rebuild it from scratch, you know. And it was like learning Russian, absolutely. A different, not even a different language, but a different vocabulary, totally. And I think we were all, there was 4 of us working, I think we were totally bamboozled by it. And it was quite frustrating at times, but yeah, it really opened my eyes to a lot of things. And funnily enough, now as I've moved on, what I'm working with, the sort of way we work with Sue is actually harking back to that a little bit more. So I think if I had the experience now, I would probably, it wouldn't be quite so unfamiliar. But at that time, it was, yeah, completely.
Could you say a little bit about the sort of the mechanical process, the way Opal Loop was mounted on
yes. You? It was an unusual thing for them because it was the first time that she'd ever allowed anybody else to learn one of her pieces. So I think they were a little bit nervous about how they were going to approach the whole thing, especially looking at the way we moved. And we were very technical dancers. We were classically trained, you know, Cunningham trained, and we approached everything with that sort of stretched, muscular ethic, and here was somebody who works release-based, it's called, which is basically working from the bones rather than using the muscles of the body, so trying to allow the weight of the movement to take each action. So they were basically trying to sort of strip us bare, if you like, of all of our preconceived ideas of certain movements. So, for instance, a leg up at the back, which we would assume to be an arabesque or whatever, would have a totally different idea behind it, would have an image behind it, would be an animal or a little sparkler or all sorts of different images. So it would be more to do with the energy flowing through the movement rather than the position itself. But it was interesting because you'd find there would be certain movements where you think, oh, I know what this is, because I've learned this, it's a circle of my leg or whatever, and you do what you thought was the movement, and it would look completely wrong because we were approaching it from the wrong angle. It was, yeah.
I think she had an effect on Richard as well.
Oh,
yes.
very
What's that
much so.
duet we used to do?
In Rough Cut?
Yeah.
Yes. No, absolutely. Absolutely.
So could you enlarge on that?
Well, he had been working the way Amanda is describing, putting kind of what I call hard shapes together, and then she came along with these ideas of different ways of using the weight, and one was to let them go, and she would do things like that, for instance, and just make everyone do it exactly like that, with no variations.
No bigger, no smaller.
Yeah,
It just had to be absolutely.
had to be exactly, and that's extremely difficult. But allowing things to build up and then fall down, catch again. He told us one day that because she'd come to the company, it sort of changed his outlook on things. Actually, I wasn't even in the piece, and it changed me. Very long auditions, 3 days long, and I remember I lasted all 3 days and got booted out the last half hour. But I had learnt that enough in those 3 days to have it feed me for quite a while. So it still does.
Yeah.
It was a rare work. It only had one cast.
Yes.
And it was never performed by our company with a second cast. There was no sense of if somebody was off, somebody else would go on. It was either we had all 4 there or we didn't perform it. And indeed, once one of the dancers had left, we had to bring her back so that we could keep, you could fulfill an engagement abroad, performing that particular work, which is not a very sort of common thing in a repertory company to operate on that basis.
Very complicatedly, the way it was pieced together was incredibly complicated. It took 2 weeks to even learn vaguely the material, and then another couple of months to sort of actually fit it together.
And for the dancers it was very interesting because it was a shift away from something that was like blatantly theatrical and out to inform the audience of perhaps the way that the dancer was feeling, and something I suppose like Ghost Dancers, and it was about dancers moving in other ways, and about the dance being informed by other qualities. Because the other thing is there's no music.
No music, yeah. And feeding off each other as well, taking cues and working with each other. So it was actually set in an enclosed space in a specific amount of room, And so that would be exactly the same wherever we went. We just marked out our space, whatever.
Can I say there was no music, but it was rhythmicized?
Yes. Yes, and funny enough, there was no music, but it was almost always exactly the same length, because the rhythm of it was so strong. I mean, not set rhythms, but the rhythm of the movement itself was so strong, and the connections between the four of us had to be so exact that it was always within about 5 seconds, the same length, maybe even less.
Yes.
And at the same time, there were Cunningham pieces, which were around this era, which had a lot of those kind of qualities in it. They had you didn't rehearse to any music, but at the same time, all the movement was rhythmicized, and the dancers could, almost down to a few seconds, it would be exactly the same length each time, which is pretty amazing. Says a lot about the body. But the Cunningham. Sorry, am I?
No, keep going, please. No. Carry on.
I think Cunningham during this period, I mean, Cunningham was the strongest influence, and his choreographic invention for the dancers seemed to be amazing and endless. And he'd worked. Trisha Brown and Merce Cunningham and Lucinda Childs were all basically from the same era. Is it true to say that? And
yes,
what could be called
Trisha
postmodern. Is that right? Is that a good term?
Yes.
Yes,
It's an acceptable term.
And he didn't dance to music. He felt that the dance was enough, and that the dance and the music didn't happen together. They happened at the same time, and you could experience them both as separate entities, but at the same time one. And it was very, very, very technical work. And I think actually Amanda had a very good technical base to cope with that kind of very, very extremely hard on the body. And so at that time we had a very good relationship with the Cunningham Company, and someone used to come over and teach.
So it's both a case of the classes, but also Chris Coman would come and mount the actual productions, and then Merce would actually see them at the end.
That's right.
So how was it actually when you got to that nasty sort of point when Merce Cunningham came in?
Terrifying. I always remember the worst time actually was in the south of France. We were luckily, it was fantastic, invited to a festival in Arles.
Yes.
And the Cunningham Company were going to be there at the same time, because they were performing the night after us, so that was already a bit nerve-wracking. Then they arranged for us to do a rehearsal of septet on stage the day before, so that Merce could come and watch the rehearsal of septet. So we thought, fine, no problem. So there we were on stage in the beating heat on a black floor at 4 o'clock in the afternoon in the south of France in the summer. And we were all getting blisters on our feet, because it was just so incredibly hot. And they were sitting out there under one of these enormous umbrellas, so we couldn't actually see them at all. And it was the most terrifying experience of my life. It was awful.
Actually, septet is to music.
Yes.
It's a very early piece. Sati, 3 movements in the shape of a pear, I think it means in English.
He has an aura, Merce Cunningham.
He does.
A real aura around him, one of those people.
And he doesn't say much. He gave me a correction once, actually.
Just once.
Just once, because actually you can be in his company. One of the dancers told me in his company that he's been there for 7 years, and he's never had a correction up Merce. So after about 3 years, you think, oh, hey, he's letting me get on with it. But after 7, he thinks, gosh,
Slightly worrying. He doesn't say much when he teaches class either. I've done class with him quite a few times, because we went to America and learned a piece with the Cunningham Company, and so we were taking class with them every day, and he'd sort of walk in and sort of shuffling, can't walk very well now, so stand by the bar and sigh and go, okay, and they'd all start, and he'd sort of mumbled something. We were like, oh no, trying desperately to follow, curving at the same time. Terrifying.
So in terms of, perhaps you would like to sort of say a little bit about Touch Base and the experience of going to actually create a work with Merce Cunningham, rather than actually just simply having it mounted on you.
Yeah, it was a very different thing, because we learned a lot about the way he makes his own work, and again, it was a new experience. They'd never done anything quite like this before, so I think they were a little bit kind of cagey about it. So we were learning. There was 1 cast of Rambert and 2 casts of Cunningham Company, and we were sort of learning it alongside. But he generally made the work on the Cunningham dancers, and then we had to sort of, come in and learn it afterwards, as it were. But he made a little section on myself and I think Glenn and Paul, and he was lovely, absolutely charming and delightful, and sort of hopped about and looked jolly happy about things. But he very much gives directions. Nowadays he choreographs mainly by computer, which I'm sure Mark will talk about because he uses computers a lot in his own work. So he'd sort of come in and he'd have a preconceived pattern, idea, rhythm, whatever, and he'd just give you directions, and that would be it, and you do it. Yes, and he could say, yes, that's right. No, a little bit more to the right. Yeah, that's right. He'd be absolutely very, very definite about it, and very quietly spoken and very, very exact. And slave driver, again and again, you do things again and again and again, really incredibly tough.
Choreographically, to be a dancer in this piece, it's a very interesting piece because he said anything could follow anything. Fast movement can follow a fast movement, or a slow movement can follow a slow movement. And I'm not sure whether anyone had come up with those ideas before, but because he's Merce Cunningham, he can get away with it. And the computer, he was using that to make this piece, wasn't it? It was one of the first pieces made on a computer.
Touchbase, yeah.
It's. Shall I want to know what it looks like, or does everyone know? It's a little figure, and it very much behaves, I think, like a Cunningham dancer, and you can manipulate the figure. Strangely enough. Well, he helped develop it, so it was really his taste and software, shall we say. And there's a new version out, but you manipulate a little figure in the corner here, and that figure does exactly what this figure's doing on the stage. And then there's a timeline at the bottom, and if you like it, you can punch it into the timeline, which you can use in units of, say, 100 seconds. And you can make a little dance by doing that. But Merce Cunningham has this thing where he makes his dances by chance. It's something to do with the I Chi and certain aspects of Buddhism, where he throws sticks. Say he has 45 variations on what you're going to do after that, which is 45 variations on that, and then he'll throw the dice to decide which one he will take. And I'm not sure whether his own taste comes into it, but he's often talked about leaving his own ego out of it. But the thing about it when you're a dancer is that they're very rich pieces, and the invention seems to go on forever and ever and ever. And, in 1 second it seems emotional, the next second it seems completely arbitrary, and then, things come and go and happen. And as a dancer, it was extremely interesting to watch these pieces unfold, and also watch different people do certain parts.
Yeah, absolutely.
In terms of the fact that the music sort of is parallel to the movement, do you ever find it distracts you?
Well, I can remember the score from... What was the piece of it?
Doubles.
Doubles.
Yeah. I mean, it is obviously, if you rehearse in silence, you're doing something that's incredibly difficult technically. And so you don't get the music until the first... Well, they don't get the music till the first night in the Cunningham Company. I think we heard it once before we were actually going to dance it, because they assumed that we weren't used to this happening, which we weren't. And it's, of course, it's really off-putting, because most of what he does is set, although it doesn't look when you watch as if it's got a particular rhythm, most of what you do is actually set on very particular counts. So I remember doing the solo that was very particular 13s, so I'd be busy counting my 13s, and there's this going on. You do better than me. It's incredibly off-putting, absolutely. I'm sure his dancers get used to it. Eventually.
What other pieces? There was Embark. That was a very important piece, not so long after.
Yes, I was going to say, Siobhan Davis coming to the company to work with you. I think that was a very exciting experience for everybody as well, wasn't it? So you were both in Embark, so perhaps that's a work to...
Later I was.
Well, Sue had been to the States. I always see this part of the Rambert phase as being sort of American in a way. Do you think it's fair to say that?
Absolutely.
And she won a Fulbright scholarship to the States and came back and made a piece to Steve Reich, an American composer whose stuff was based on Bharatanatyam. It's fair to say that, isn't it? Yeah. Bharatanatyam rhythms. And she made this piece on her experience of travelling through landscapes in America. And it was very sparse, but it had a wonderful weaving intricacy all the way through. And there was a pas de deux. I was the partner, at that time. I always did a lot of lifting
Yeah,
about, didn't I?
used to complain about it.
I was kind of, no, I loved it. And there was a series of pieces, and in fact, what was the piece we did at the Paris Opera with Richard, that was made on us.
Yes.
And it had, yes, rough cut. It had a central duet with other kind of activities in it. And again, I think the kind of movement we were doing was more physical based, more along the lines of dancers who moments of interest and consequence are made by the choreographers based on the dancer's technique. So when we were in there, we were always exhausted because we always had to do class and always had to sort of slave away trying to perfect. I think Richard at that time sort of almost purified us in a way to speak with our bodies.
About dance speaking for itself.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very much so, rather than speaking out through the emotions and gesture and whatever. It's about the dance, the pure dance speaking for itself. It was the whole ethic, I think, of that era, really.
And there was a sort of a motto that he used. First and foremost, the repertoire will be informed by movement.
Yeah.
I mean, not to say that that doesn't carry emotions with it. But as a dancer, practically getting through the repertoire and the work, it was about
perfecting and making shapes.
Perfecting a certain way of looking at technique.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so.
So, Mark, let's talk just a little bit about how you sort of came to start choreographing for the company and your own works.
I think I really am a product of Rambert because because the two big pieces I did in the early days was Pierrot Lunaire, which was emotionally based. It was the shape of content, one of those old reading books for people who study dance at American colleges by Ben Shawn, I think his name is. Everything meant something. No gesture or dance movement was put into the phrase. Everything meant something. And then the other piece I used to do was Soda Lake. So I was very luckily able to pick up on the extremes of what was going on, the heavily emotionally based one, and the other one, which, to use that word, which I don't really like using because I really don't know what it is, abstract shapes. And in fact, Richard says that Soda Lake was based on some ideas that informed a work by Martha Graham, whose whole thing was about finding physicality to match emotional situations. But as I stayed in Rwanda, I started to use the studios downstairs after work and sort of came up with ways of improvising, and I realised that in my improvisations what I was actually doing, all the stuff was coming out that we had been exposed to. There was Lucinda Charles, there was Tricia Brown, there was Nurse Cunningham, there was most probably a bit of Ashley Page, there was Sue Davies, and there was quite a lot of Richard Alston, and of course there was Glenn Tetley, and there was a lot of Christopher Bruce, because Christopher Bruce had a certain kind of instinct for certain sort of theatricality, whereas Richard sort of headed for letting the dance speak. And these mixtures all sort of mushy together, and I'd come up with a way of moving that was quite peculiar. But actually what it was informed by the kind of roles I had actually danced when I was in Rambert. And I think actually it was a fantastic period to be in Rambert because we were exposed to so much.
Absolutely.
And so I was kind of grateful for that, really. But, when it comes to the Madame Rambert thing, there was a spirit that we were there to sort of almost be part of something that was forging, almost like, the fact that she'd come from the Ballet Russe and brought this idea that, she should always be hunting and looking for new ways to say things through the medium of dance. And I think, there was that.
There was a sense of that, most definitely.
Yeah. And that every time.
Ideas.
Yeah.
It was a whole new way. Well, it was at that time. It was a whole new way. There wasn't anything like that in this country at that time.
Yes.
I mean, obviously, since things have burgeoned, but it really felt then that we were doing something new, and that felt important. Actually, it felt important to be exploring those things.
But I think, in the long run, what's good about it is it's all breaking down. It's no longer shifting in waves of fashion. You know, anyone can do anything now. I mean, Twyla Tharp was here recently, and she was saying, you know, abstract painting isn't enough anymore. You know, and so I think those kind of ideas are sort of floating through the dance community. That you know, anything, it's up to us to make whatever new is.
So Amanda, how did you find it when Mark was choreographing for you? It's putting you on the spot.
Actually, my first piece for Rambert was called Island to Island. And Amanda, of course, is married now, very happily married. But at that time, she kept saying to me, I'd really like a boyfriend, you know. And so I had this idea to make, which often seems to crop up, actually, where I have a couple dancing and then a single person, and the single person at that time was Amanda. And so the single person wants to be the couple, and the couple aren't so happy with each other and would prefer to be single and look admiringly at the single person.
Well, that's what it was about.
Yeah. So that's but Amanda had this sort of long, leggedy, sinewy, very strong way of moving, and so I made this solo for her in the middle of it. Anyway, sorry, I interrupted. I was answering a question for you.
No, absolutely. It was enormous fun, absolutely enormous fun. I mean, it wasn't anything to do with, you know, sort of choreographer and, well, obviously it is choreographer and dancer, but it felt like working with a colleague and somebody you respect, and, you know, and you're interested to experiment. And Mark, I think, was very much starting out on a path which he's really continued since with his own company as well. But that was probably the first piece that you'd made that was really on that.
I had made things on Amanda before, so it was about using dance personalities I knew, because I'd actually made Pussyfooting on you.
That's right.
And I sort of knew a way into Amanda's dance personality.
But it felt like that was a beginning of a new way of moving that you'd really found. And so it was kind of experimenting with new ideas that Mark wanted to work with, and it's great fun. And then we did Gone. That's great fun.
I think Ghost Dancers had a big influence on me as well. It had an appeal, just an immediate appeal, and and a lot of the stuff that we were doing at that time was really quite dry, which was great to do. But I was trying to find a way to remove the dryness somehow, but keep the intelligence of something that might what we used to call, oh, that's well crafted.
Yes.
That's right. Because when you were dancing, remember, there was always a lot of talk about the choreographers that happened to be there. And I remember before Lucinda Childs came, Colin Poole said, well, you know, if it's good or bad, you know, it's going to be art. And around that time, we revived Glenn Tetley's piece called Embrace Tiger, which I suppose was very important in the development of the company. And Amanda, I tossed you around a bit, didn't I?
Yes, I think in that sense, I mean, there is always that sense of importance of the company's heritage. It's not just, oh, that was a work from the past. There is a sense of looking at works from the past and considering whether they do fit in with current sort of interests. And
Rombert's
like
directors,
I
think, have always done that. And we revived Dark Energies.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yes, I remember Amanda at one point, because there was no point work pieces, and then suddenly there was a point work piece, and there was Amanda Britton, who I'd never seen in point.
Oh, she'd never been in point since school.
Yeah.
Used to nearly be sick. I was so scared. It's terrible. I'm looking forward very much to seeing
So
it.
am I.
Very much seeing it tonight.
Actually, elderly artists came out of the blue to help us with that.
Yes, it was in some senses, it was the last chance to bring that generation back in for the involvement that we haven't obviously had this time. I don't think this was elderly artists out of the blue. If you just move along one and then Christopher, come and join in. Absolutely on cue. Perfect timing.
Thank you.
Obviously, no introduction needed to Christopher Bruce, and we're absolutely delighted that he's found time to come along and join this session. it's almost sort of unnecessary to sort of mention things, and particularly since most of you have been here for yesterday and for what's already been said today, so one already gets a sense of his importance for the company. I think one of the things that came out yesterday in what Norman Morris and John Chesworth were saying was the fact that Christopher was also a very great dancer, and somebody who in that sense is missed on the stage, and of course Mark's referred back to that in terms of Pierrot Lunaire. Christopher was in fact the first person to receive the Evening Standard Award for dance. They created it for Christopher. And that was both as a dancer and as a choreographer. And I think it's quite interesting that from 1974 he was being regarded in a dual way. In terms of Rambert, again, like Amanda, very much a product of the company, having been through the Rambert School, danced with the company for many years. In 1974, becoming associate director alongside John Chesworth. 1980, changing his position to associate choreographer. And then after a period in the latter part of the 80s, when he was in enormous demand, as he still is, worldwide, and working freelance, coming back to take up the role of artistic director of the company in 1994. The company actually had to wait a whole season to get him because he was already so busy. So that's just a little bit of background, probably totally unnecessary. And we'll go back to what has been the first question put to everybody on these panels. And that is really about your first experience of meeting Marie Rambert.
Well, you have to imagine these corridors at the Mercury Theatre. And I was 13, going on 14 years old. I'd just joined the Rambert School. And for part of the day, I was doing academic lessons. And then I'd come across the road and we'd take the dance classes. And I was incredibly ignorant. I'd never been to the ballet before I actually started to dance. But when I came to Rambert, people talked about Marie Rambert. And so she was just a figure in my head, as it were. And the building was steeped in her sort of mystique and power. It was also a time, it was quite close to the death of Ashley Duke, so there was a feeling of the kind of hush about the place, because in a sense I think everyone was still mourning Ashley. My first sight of her one day was when one of the other students pointed her out in one of these little corridors, this small grey-haired lady, and I sort of just stared, really. And that was my first sight of Rambert. But I already knew of the legend. And from then on I began to see her around more. I would peer through, I could just about reach the portholes and peer through into the studio and watch her teaching. But more than seeing her, I remember hearing her a great deal, because sort of the voice reached a lot of areas of the building on occasions. So that was my very first memory. A little while after, about a year or so, I began to do classes which she taught. I can't remember exactly when, but I began to do class with her.
And how did you find her as a teacher?
I'm going to maybe shock a few people here, but I don't think on a technical level she was a great teacher. I think she'd just been recently influenced by the Russians, so there was an awful lot of doing pliés on account of sort of 16, which is, and as the pianist was very often late, we often started the class with her counting 1, 2, 3, and she'd give us sort of about half a minute of correction and go 4, 5, so you'd be frozen in these positions. It was a very slow class and it was slightly erratic. I remember sort of développés which you held to your leg tremble, which tended to build strength but enormous thigh muscles. So I'm not sure that she was a great teacher technically, but what she was already in class was a great producer of the dance, and this I think everyone understood, and I certainly did. It's how she coached and what she talked about and bullied for, and this went on into the rehearsals when I joined the company. She would take me through a solo until I was literally legless, and I think when you're young you enjoy being pushed past that point where you're no longer exhausted. You're literally, you can't actually stand up. Because she never took that into consideration, that you might get tired. So I mean, she was ferocious, but one was with her, and when she was producing, trying to get a quality, I think everyone understood, even when she was cruel, that why she was trying to do it. Sometimes it went a little bit overboard, and there was a point as a kind of very angry young teenager when we clashed, because I just found sometimes that she was so cruel. She was cruel to a girlfriend of mine at the time, and I thought, I walked out of the studio and she didn't speak to me for 3 months, but this is a story I think everyone knows, where she sent her corrections in class via a third party because she wouldn't speak to me, and she wouldn't mention my name, so it was tell the boy in the blue tights to jump higher or something like that. And that went on for about 3 months, and in a sense it was a very peaceful time. But then she called me into the office one day and said, I have decided to speak to you again, even though you haven't apologized, because you're too talented for me to waste the opportunity. So I was back under the sort of the hammer again. But to this day, I don't quite understand, because by this time I was a dancer in the company. I don't understand why I wasn't fired. I was so arrogant and believed that, had almost a divine right to be there, But looking back, I was not a strong dancer at the time. I was only really learning my craft, and I think I only got into the company because of a reference from Walter Gore, and because Rambert had seen something in me. And she believed in me, and it's that sort of belief that sort of was the basis of everything I've ever done. But as I say, to this day, I don't know what she saw in me at that time, or why. But and I don't understand why I wasn't thrown out of the company. I should have been. I was much better behaved later. So those are my early memories. As time went on, we became very close friends, and in later years I spent a lot of time with her, especially in her sitting room. I would take my children, we'd have tea, and we'd talk, and even after I'd retired from dancing, she was still correcting me and getting me to hold on to the mantel shelf and practice things. She was still working on it. I didn't remind her that I'd stopped. Wouldn't have made any difference.
How did she react to your choreography when you began as a choreographer?
I don't actually, the first piece I did was George Frideric. It was already the reformed company under Norman Morris. And I don't remember her reaction to the piece when she saw it, but I just remember from an early time she was always very supportive, believed in what I was doing, and I remember she was very thrilled when I did a piece called For These Who Die as Cattle, which was that was 1971, because she had this theory that dance should be as strong as any of the other art forms, and it shouldn't necessarily have to rely on music. And therefore I made a dance in silence, and she felt that this really supported her theory. Of course, we all know that's true. Dance doesn't necessarily need music. It can be greatly helped, and it can rely on music, but it can just through pure good composition hold the stage in silence. And she was quite right in this. And what I think she was expressing was her belief that dance was equal to all the other art forms.
Yes. That ties in very neatly with things that we've actually been talking about earlier. I wonder if it's just worth your saying a word about George Frideric. Yesterday, John Chesworth and Norm Morris were here.
What did they
and
say?
They were talking about choreographers emerging from the company, and with reference to you and this work, saying that as your first work, you were a reluctant choreographer, and it was an agonising process for all concerned. And then afterwards, choreography seemed to start to flow from you. And I wonder if you would like to just sort of comment on that as an interpretation of your first experience of choreography.
Well, I didn't want to choreograph at first. We had these workshops, and Jeanette Cochran, and for the first few years, I never considered that I would choreograph. But I found out there was one year, and I was in 11 pieces or something in an evening. It was a long evening. We weren't all long pieces, and one could see that certain people had talent for composition, but many did not. And in the end, I just got to a point where I felt maybe I could do as well, and that's where I came from. I thought, well, I'll try. Then I started listening to the Handel, and I began to sort of, as I've always done since, is to see a shape, a sort of a dance in my mind. And so I went to Norman and asked him if I could do the piece, and he agreed, which I thought was very trusting of him. And it wasn't in a workshop, it was a piece for the company. So I started work, and it was like pulling teeth. It was much harder than I imagined it would be. It was only a 15-minute piece, but it took me a rather long time. And I mean, Gary McSween, who is now a rehearsal director in the company, suffered in that first piece. I thought everyone was very patient. But it was so hard. And then finally, I made this very complicated and difficult dance for Jonathan Taylor, who was a real turner, jumper, spinner, virtuoso dancer. And damn me if he wasn't off just before the premiere. So I had to go on in Edinburgh, in the Lyceum, and dance all these difficult technical things. I learned a great lesson. Not to make things so difficult that I couldn't, if need be, replace them. I drew a line at replacing any of the girls, but all the guys, I did their parts. And I remember being terribly nervous and not dancing it very well. But it seemed to go very well and found its place in the repertoire. And then I remember having a conversation with Glenn Tetley over the phone, and said, never again. I've done one, that's it. And he said, no, you say that now, but in a few weeks you'll be thinking of something else. And he was absolutely right. And then I went on to make Living Space, which again was basically in silence. I used these poems, which were composed alongside the piece. And from then on, I would finish a piece, be exhausted, but it wouldn't be long before something else came to mind. So I don't know where it came from, really, but it's true that I was reluctant in the sense that I didn't ever see myself as a choreographer, even after I'd made the first piece.
And then it just gradually built up.
Yes, yes. Then I had periods where I didn't think I could go and do it, where I felt I had no new ideas. I'd maybe do a piece that really didn't work for me, and one would go down into the pits. Then somehow you have another idea. Well, try once more, and somehow you go through these patches, and the rest is history, really. But each piece I start is as difficult as the first piece in a way. It doesn't get any easier because you ask yourself to do better than ever you've done before, and you try. I mean, you have a style, you have certain things you put into your works, so you do repeat yourself, but you try to find something new to say or develop what you've done before. But what's always important, and I was taught this right from the beginning by Norman and Rombe and Glenn Tetley, that you must be very true to yourself. The work must have integrity. It doesn't matter what style or technique you're using, it must have a truth, it must be sincere.
So where do you get most of your ideas from, do you think?
Ideas probably from either literature or everyday occurrences, something you see in life, right? Whether it be on television, through the newspaper, or one's personal experience. Those are where the ideas come from. mostly. Now and again I will have a movement idea alone, and I'll enjoy exploring that. But then the movement ideas come with the idea, and I sort of try to merge them.
So shall we sort of just perhaps move to the current work at the moment, and perhaps talk a little bit about Quicksilver that had its London premiere last night. That's a piece obviously done for a specific occasion, but perhaps you could sort of just talk a bit about the ideas and how it came into being.
I seem to have done a lot of these pieces recently with Meeting Point for San Francisco with the United Nations celebrations. I kind of sometimes enjoy being set a certain test that, you know, I have to stick to an idea, and I think it's a very important test for any choreographer to have that brief, and you mustn't sort of go off in another direction. You must find a vocabulary which is particular to that piece, and this limits you, but it also gives you a focus. And with Quicksilver, it was for the 70th anniversary, and I wanted to just do something to celebrate that anniversary. And I'd seen the film The Piano, and there was just, which is, I think, thought a very good film. And a lot of the music was based on Scottish ballads, folk tunes and songs, which I'm a sucker for. So I loved the quality in a lot of the music. But there was one moment in the film that moved me to tears. And it was so strange, because it was they were on the beach, the piano was there, and the woman was playing, and the little child was just turning cartwheels. And of course, we all know that cartwheels are in the Rambert history, because Rambert always turned cartwheels for some strange reason. And it reminded me of so many things. It reminded me of my daughter when she was very young, dressing up in sort of old clothes, costumes, or my wife's dresses, and sort of doing these dramatic dances all over the front room carpet, or in the garden, say, "I'm Red Rosa now, and this is a very sad bit," and she'd really get into it. And I love that kind of quality that children have about sort of losing themselves in fantasy and a part. And I feel it's very close to what actors and dancers and singers do when we go on every night. It's like it's a job for people that really want to remain very childlike in a way. We can fantasize, we can go into another world, we can preoccupy ourselves with, you know, just dancing, which is something we lose as we grow up. You know, children have it naturally. And so all these ideas came, this child cartwheeling, Rambert cartwheeling, my daughter dancing, that's where the ballet came from. So what I did was I sort of, first of all, my daughter then bought me the CD. I would play it in my car. And the main theme, piano theme, I just imagined a dance where this girl was dancing like my daughter used to, just making it up as she went along. And I kept seeing one specific dancer doing it. I saw Joanne Fong in Rambert. I could just see her doing this, and that was the nucleus of the piece. And I knew I was going to make a dance, but she was just kind of making it up and enjoying in a very Isadora Duncan quality. Isadora was a great influence on Rambert. So that was where it all came from. Then I chose 7 other tracks, and I built it up, and I tried to create a space, maybe backstage or in a warehouse, but something that had a feeling of a time that was past. And I tried to sort of suggest with the little bits of clothing that we'll find in the skips or hanging up, or the hats they would put on, that it would change the character, and they would do a dance which was described by the costume. So it would change their personalities. And that's all I've done. And during the dance I try to evoke a lot of little ideas that no one needs really to know about, because I like the ambiguity of dance and the fact that there are all kinds of ideas there. There are things relating to Rambert, there are things relating to my life, but especially to what I feel very much at the moment which is that our time of being like children dancing on the stage is really so short that we wear the Rambert hat for a while, and then we pass it on to the next generation. And coming back to Rambert and wearing the director's hat for a while just made me very reflective. So that's what the piece was basically about. And of course, the hat came into the piece because of the very famous photograph of Rambert holding the straw hat that she would not give up. She was determined. She held it in front of the camera like that. And it just said a lot about this 10-year-old girl. And I mean, the spirit was there right at 10 years old. The spirit continued right the way through her life, brought the company through tremendously difficult times. She survived, and she left a wonderful legacy, which I hope is still remaining. And I think those roots, that tradition, never mind all the changes and the new waves that come, it's something there that has made the company able to survive for so long. And it comes directly out of her spirit, because she passed it on to one person after another without those people realizing it in a way. So it sounds horrendously complicated, but it's a very simple piece, and it's a piece that has these little abbreviations in it. It doesn't flow, it keeps hesitating. It's like you think, and then the next thing takes over, and even at the end, it's because never, life is like that. You're caught short all the time, and things pass so quickly. I can't believe I'm 50 years old and I'm directing this company. It feels like only yesterday I was a student in the school. So the piece is about anything else apart from Rembrandt. It's about time, the great enemy, really.
In terms of that, you're sort of saying you're sort of surprised to be taking over Rambert. And perhaps you would actually sort of talk a little bit about what made you agree to take up the position, why you became artistic director of Rambert Dance Company.
I'd never wanted to direct. When I left as associate director, and I left the company in '79 to freelance, and then I came back as an associate choreographer, and I danced a little with the company as a guest. But I never wanted to direct, and whatever pressure there was one time when I thought I might do it if I was needed, but in the end I wasn't. And I've always enjoyed the freedom of being able to just be a creative artist, because I knew what direction meant. It's a thankless job, and it's very, very time-consuming and quite can be soul-destroying at times. And I've tried to do it in a particular way so that it wouldn't destroy my soul, that I could get something out of it. And I think on the whole I have. But again, I was reluctant to direct, but because it was Rambert, I felt there was no option, because I knew from what I was hearing that it was very much on the cards that LCDT and Rambert might close, because they would save a great deal of money and they'd maybe feed it to the independent sector, which also needs money desperately. And so there was a lot of arm twisting and persuading, and I spent 3 days just talking it over with my wife, because I knew it was as much a decision for her as for me. And then I decided to do it. The problem, it seemed to me, was not an artistic problem. It was an economic problem. And I've tried to sort of get that over in as many interviews as possible. It was just, the climate was no longer amenable to the smaller sort of middle range company. I didn't see how that range of company with the limitations on it could survive, because you had to start making more money. You could not just produce good work and not get the audiences in, because the financial pressures are so great now. So the climate had changed, and I'd had an opportunity to see a lot of other companies on my travels. So I had an idea of how I thought it could work, how the contemporary dance repertory system could still manage to function. And I said it would have to be bigger, there would have to be a greater variety of dancers in the company so that the range of repertoire could be enormous, and that you could begin to fill bigger theatres and get the box office income. So I looked at it not just from an artistic perspective, but from a business one. Say, well, if I was in business and I wanted to make this company that was in difficulty survive, how can we save it? And of course the idea was not to go smaller, but to enlarge and go for broke, really. And I think I have to say that it's paying off. It's been very tough, and we're still financially having a difficult time. But I think the principle is working. I just believe that if you can provide a very high quality, in the crudest terms, product, in terms of a wonderful company dancing good work, okay, combining with experimentation, but always providing an exciting and stimulating and enjoyable, engaging evening in the theatre, just at a very high level in all areas, that you could bring a larger and wider audience in. Because without that wider audience, I could just see the art form shrinking to a point where it would be only for a very, very few people, very few companies, and a lot of dancers out of work. Otherwise they'd all be in ballet companies, still dancing only the classics,
yes,
which is a major problem.
Well, you've obviously proved that there is an audience there, because they're coming rushing into the Colosseum very happily at the moment. Just two things I think that might be worth mentioning. Firstly, basically how you select the repertory. And then the other thing is that I think that the whole musical side has been very important for the company at the moment. So perhaps you could just say a word about those two things.
Well, Rambert has a wonderful advantage in that it has a marvellous repertoire of works. And as you know, we've revived Dark Elegies. And I think if I have that sort of library of works, and I can keep taking those books out from time to time, it's a marvellous foundation on which to build. The main aim for me is that the company remains basically creative, that there's a lot of new work coming in. For any company to survive, whether it be a classical or a contemporary company, is essential that within that company there are creative forces, at least one. And therefore, apart from myself being able to create works, I'm very anxious that I can develop more choreographers from within the company. So I feel that we must have this in-house work that we can keep going. I thought then that it was very important for me to be able to provide Rambert to various British or people working in Britain, British choreographers, at least once a year, to bring an independent into the company to work, so that I'm providing a service to these independent people who do not have a large company and the ability to have an orchestra, etc. That was part of my plan. And the other part was to invite guests from abroad, so we can sort of widen the range of work that people see in this country, because there's a lot happening abroad that we just don't see most of the time. And so basically, I'm taking from these various areas, and it's flexible, but that is mainly what I'm doing, and that's how I select. And I try to kind of form programs that are strong and good evenings in the theatre, but if I have a new work, I'll try and put something tried and tested with it, so that choreographer has the right to fail if he or she wants. I'm hoping that in time I can experiment more, but I have to make sure that that audience knows and loves and trusts Rambert enough to stay with us during the dips. Maybe you have a bad evening sometime, but hopefully they'll come back again because they've seen so many good evenings. That is basically it. It sort of sounds complicated, but it's really very straightforward. It's not so easy to find choreographers, I have to say, because most of the good choreographers are very busy, and you can rarely get them to create something new for you.
Which, of course, is the same situation that you're faced with. Everybody's after some of your works, or would love to have more choreography from you elsewhere. And so you're almost faced with a dilemma, being in such demand internationally.
Yeah, I feel I did that, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to direct. I was getting a little tired of, getting on and off planes, even if it meant that I had long periods of time when I would be, on my own with Marion. But I don't need to do that. I will fulfill my obligations to Houston, and there are some promises that I pushed further away that I couldn't fit in before I took over, which are sort of things that are coming home to roost at the moment, and I'm going to be busy during the autumn and spring of next year, but I'm trying to do as little as possible. I'm just sort of delaying, because I want at the moment to keep all my energy for Rambert till I feel it is secure, because I think we're a long way from being secure. We've made great strides, but there's so much work still to do.
Right, I think...
No, I didn't say about the music.
The music, yes.
Yes. It's been very important for me, first of all, to keep maintain live music for dance, and not just music, but music played superbly. And this is why we went into this relationship with the London Musici, and I think we have provided very high quality music. It's expensive, and I've been under fire at times, because I'm spending a lot of money on the musical side, but I believe it's right. If we're going to have choreographers are going to have the ability to select from a variety of music, we must have not only quite a large orchestra, but we must have an orchestra that can play it at least as well as the ballets are being danced on stage. And I feel very proud of what we've achieved in that area. And I know that Mark Stevenson now is leaving us to spend more time working for his orchestra, but we are continuing to work with London Musici, and I'm hoping that relationship will continue.
Right. I honestly don't think we're allowed to keep you here any longer, as much as one would like to. You promised us half an hour, and we've had our half hour.
I don't mind a few questions.
You don't mind? Right. If anybody has questions that they would like to put, this is your opportunity. Total silence.
Well, there's always silence.
You were saying that you've got this background of Rambert works on the shelf, and well, in the past I've seen quite a number of old ones, although I haven't seen a lot of the new work. But which ones are you thinking you might take off the shelf?
Aha.
Or would that be terrible?
I'm not going to tell you which ones, but what I'd like to do, having gone back to the 30s, I'd like to sort of come back to probably the 60s, 70s and look at some of the work from that period. What is difficult is trying to decide what will work today, because there's no point in bringing something back, however great a ballet it was, if it isn't going to work today. And there are sometimes you have to leave them a little longer before you bring them back. But I'm looking at the period of the 70s and through the 80s too. I'd like to do some quite recent work, because although it's a very different company to the one that Richard led, I think there was so much fine work made under Richard Alston that and I feel I don't want to neglect that period of work. And so I'm looking basically that early period of the new Rambert after 66 and the latter period before I took over. At the moment.
The performance works. And Ghost Dancers that you Mark mentioned is one of the ones. Lonely House, Lonely Street, no, Lonely Town. Intimate Pages, Sergeant Early's Dream. Quite a lot have been put out. So
well, we did Sergeant Early's Dream in the first year, of course, which I'm fond of, actually. I like Sergeant Early.
There are probably quite a few people around who've been watching some
Yes.
of these works and might feel they'd like to come back and see
Yeah,
them.
it's very useful that they see them on television, because I think it worked very much with Rooster. People saw Rooster on television. It brought a lot of people into the theatre, and in a sense, this year Rooster has really saved our bacon. I mean, the programme that Rooster was in, people came to see it. One of my problems has been, having to keep that work in the repertoire, with the dancers having to dance so many shows of it, and I've got 2 complete casts, so they don't have to dance them all. But I'm trying to, leave it out. I'm bringing it back for foreign dates because they always ask for it at the moment. But it's a dangerous thing when you have a useful work like that, and to maintain it so it doesn't, because it's always successful, it can very easily degenerate and lose the kind of the composition and the clarity of the movement. And I have to keep at them, and it's really difficult to know how much to correct without sort of driving them mad. I mean, it's so difficult, but at the same time, those works become cornerstones that you can build a repertoire around, knowing that people will come, and I can put something maybe a little more difficult with it, as long as I feel it works as a program.
Yes.
I'm always very interested in how choreographers work. Norman Morris yesterday explained how his method of working had evolved from coming into the rehearsal studio with everything set to eventually actually coming to the studio working on the dancers. Do you find that your method of working has evolved over the years, or do you still stick to the same formula?
I think I work very much as I did originally, which is to, if I'm working to a score, listen over and over again. I mean, Frederick Ashton always said that he would sort of just sit there with the music washing over him, and I think a lot of us do that, and I certainly live with the music like that for a while. And if I can get hold of a score, I'll try and, especially if it's a difficult piece, I'll look at the score, and I'll have an idea about the quality of movement. I may have a few steps in my mind, but basically I just have an overall feeling about the piece, but I don't prepare the choreography. I work in the studio, and I don't think that's ever really changed. I like to work off the people that I'm making the dance for. If I'm making something for Mark, Mark will be in that piece, because I like the dangerous situation where you're kind of naked in the studio. Really, they were looking at you, give us a step, and you don't know what to do. Well, let's try this, and it's always a scary moment, and you just got to find something. And I depend on those personalities. I make my dances about the dancers I work with, I think.
And how do you feel about subsequent casts, rather, because those choreographers, I think, do work like this. You're very much inspired by the original cast. But if a work goes on to a second cast or is revived in later years, does it not present
Well,
problems
it
in
does
that respect?
create problems, except you know what you're after. You know the piece. It exists, so that I can, if I want to give a boy Mark's role, I'll find someone that has similar characteristics as Mark. They can maybe do it in a different way. This is why I always insist on being there for the casting and the early rehearsals of any of my work. I never just leave it to an assistant. It means that I don't produce my work as often as many other choreographers, but I just don't believe in sending assistants. It doesn't work with my work. So I need to work with those people and make that suit of clothes fit them, so that it may not fit them at first, but I cut a little here and I change it for them and I reproduce it. And so then it lives on these people.
I think actually we do have to bring the proceedings to a close, because I'm sure we're going to be thrown out of this space before very long, unfortunately. Several things to say. First of all, obviously, to thank our three speakers tonight. Amanda, busy career at the moment working with Siobhan Davis rather than with Ron Bear, but as I said, still getting called in every now and again. Mark Baldwin with his own company, and he's going to be on television
18th of this month.
18th of this month.
10 o'clock, between 10 and 10:30, BBC One. Short film.
That's his advertisement. Christopher's work, of course, can be seen at the London Coliseum this week. If you haven't yet got your tickets, rush round and get them.
They're nearly all gone.
Which is a wonderful experience for the company. Cause of great pride, great excitement.
I'll get paid this month.
Also, I'll just mention that there is, of course, the matinee on Saturday, which is music and dance. It's a concert with dance input, which is something that has developed recently with the company and been very exciting, and an opportunity to see different choreography than we're performing in London.
Yes, you see Dee Veldman. Sorry, I keep interrupting, Denny. But Dee Veldman's ballet, she's a dancer in the company. She's had a very successful, done a very successful first work with the company.
So that's my thanks to the speakers. Also, obviously, we have to thank the Theatre Museum for the space, the opportunity to do these talks, and for indeed recording them. I think the fact that we have had 3 evenings of what I have found absolutely fascinating information about Ron Bear, and I feel so embarrassed about it all, because having just produced the book, third advertisement, discovered new things as we've gone along. Not that there's probably been space to put them in there, and it complements the material there. If you haven't yet bought the book, there's still an opportunity to do so. If you've already bought it, don't forget Christmas is not far away. All your friends need copies as well. So that's just basically the commercial plug. But thanks very much to the Theatre Museum for hosting these events, and thank you for coming. You've made it all possible too. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I came over you too. Beautiful. How are you?
I'm
knackered, yeah, I can imagine.
I've signed 500 programs.
Oh, I see.
It's so cool. Can't believe, I'm sort of stunned by it actually, the reaction. I was so nervous, particularly about the second program, because it's so untested really, because I didn't know how it would work as a program. And with 2 of the works being so recently developed, there was no time for them to sort of work in, you know, and develop.
Sorry,
What?
501.
What's this?
could you sign it for...
Yes.
You have to wait with me. I'm sorry, I'll look after you. Everything out.